Right, in this section we're going to talk a little bit about process mapping. But first of all, what is a process and why does it matter? If you ever think about processes that you're familiar with, what are they in your business or in your organisation? There might be a chart on the wall maybe that you follow for a process, or it might be a dusty old flow chart in the bottom of a cupboard somewhere. But in reality, processes are everywhere. And sometimes it can seem restrictive, it can seem something that's really bureaucratic and a set of rules we must follow and it's set in stone and we're not allowed to change it. But really, what are processes? Well, all they are is a set of steps from a start to an end that are designed to achieve an outcome of some kind. So when you think about it like that, everything we do in business is a process. Everything we do in our life is a process. Going to the shops to buy our groceries is a process. So understanding them is really important, and describing them in a way that we can all understand together is crucial if we're looking to improve that particular activity or that particular process. So to work with processes, we need to understand them, and we need this sort of common language that helps us describe them to each other. And the benefit of that is that we can then all understand how that process works. We can all understand what steps need to happen and in what order. We can start to understand who's responsible for what bit. And we can also start to understand what are the key things that process step needs before it can be completed and it can move on to the next one. It helps us understand the relationships between all the steps, particularly in complex processes. Think about it, most of the time the processes that we deal with in our day-to-day life aren't just dealt with by ourselves. We're working with a number of different people, and that might be different people in different teams, in different parts of the business, in different disciplines, different companies in different parts of the world even. So being able to describe processes in a way that everybody understands is really important and super valuable when you're looking at continuous improvement. So process mapping is a fantastic tool to be able to visualise a project as a picture rather than lots of different flowcharts and diagrams. You can get around it, you can all agree on what's right or wrong about that process, what's actually going on. But it helps us to make clear what's maybe a little bit ambiguous, steps that perhaps we thought were in one area and they're actually in somewhere else, a dependency that we didn't realise was there. Suddenly all these things can become clear. We can identify bottlenecks and constraints, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it gives us a standard eventually, one way of doing that process that helps us move forward and improve. And there are lots of great tools that we can use, lots of different tools, depending on the situation and depending on what you're trying to achieve. We can talk about swim lane mapping in a little minute, spaghetti mapping, if you've ever used that in your areas where you trace all the movements of individuals within a team to see where the waste is. We've got value stream mapping. There's a section on value stream mapping a little bit later on. BPN, business process modelling and notation, is quite a technical method of mapping, flow charts, and of course SIPOC that we've mentioned several times, a high level view of the overall process and the inputs and the outputs and the stakeholders who are involved in that process. But when we actually get to process mapping, it can be tricky and we can end up getting a little bit confused in the processes that we use. So I'd like to talk a little bit about process mapping levels. So I've used an example here where we are making a meal. Let's assume we are a high level process, sort of the process levels that would be within our SIPOC are about making a meal. So we're aiming for about 6, 8, certainly no more than 10 steps at a really high level to understand what those big chunks of that process might be. So in this example, at level 1, at the highest level, we're choosing which meal to make. We're looking at getting the ingredients and the equipment together. We're preparing those ingredients and that equipment. We're going to cook the food and then we're going to serve the food. So at a really high level, that's the process end to end, right? That's our scope of our process that we want to work on. So at a really high level, that's how we make a meal, right? But there's no detail in that. There's no information that we can really work with. So we need to break that down to the next level. So at level 2, cooking the food, we can break that a little bit further down. And we can say, okay, this meal I've chosen is a roast dinner, right? So we're going to cook the carrots, we're going to cook the potatoes, we're going to cook the meat and the parsnips, everything else. We're going to prepare some sauces, some gravy, maybe whatever it is we need to have with that meal. One of the really important things, Yorkshire puddings. I'm from Yorkshire, so it's really important that we get this right. So, okay, we can take Yorkshire puddings as a process step and break that down further. And at this point, we get into level 3 in this process. So we're looking at the process steps it takes to make a Yorkshire pudding. Heating the oven, beating the eggs and the flour, and all the rest you can read there. But what we do with process mapping is we try not to go too much further than that. The next level down in this case would be a real standard operating procedure that tells you how to operate the oven, or it tells you how many eggs to beat, or it tells you how hot the oven needs to be. So we try and stop just before we get to the pressing buttons and turning dials state of things as we would do in manufacturing. So we try and keep it so that, in theory, if we changed our system or we changed our equipment, the process map would still work. We might need to change an SOP, maybe, or some other instructions because the equipment might change, but the process map would stay the same. So when we eventually do start getting together, and this is a getting together kind of event, it's not something you do by yourself, this is something you do with the team who are working on the process, a collaborative event. We can start to use some of the tools and equipment that we'd recommend for doing this job. And I would always say, start with Post-it notes, or start with a whiteboard, something that you can erase and change and tweak and move. Don't ever be tempted to process map directly into software, because it will just cause untold confusion with you and the team. So start on a Post-it note with Sharpie pens and start mapping out those process steps. Now, we have some sort of standard set of tools here, icons rather, that you might use. So it's generally a green dot or a green oval for the start of the process. Now, this is important when we're trying to understand scope, because there can only ever be one start. So we've got to make a real effort to define what the start of that process is, what the trigger is, what causes it to jump into action. Is it a piece of paper lands on somebody's desk? Is it a certain time of day? Is it when a certain order comes through the door? What is it that starts that process? And it's important to really define that at the start of the process mapping activity. Then you've got your boxes, and those are the actions that you have in your process. And you only want one step per box, because you might want to move them around a little bit. Circles can represent inspections. It could be to do with quality or anything like that, any sort of checking activity or approval activity. And diamonds. Diamonds are really important. They show gateways, we call them, or decision points. This is where the process could go one way or another. Is it a yes-no question? Is it something that we need to get a decision made upon? That's represented with a diamond. And then the end points. Now, we've got one start, but we might have many end points. The process might end with an error, or it might end in one team, or it might end in another team. There might be many different end points to a particular process. But these are the basic symbols. Now, you can go into a lot of detail about this. There are hundreds out there for all the different mapping techniques. If you look at BPMN, for example, there are lots and lots of different notations that you can use for different types of industries and different types of process. I would always say use the fewer you can, because what you're trying to do is communicate with people. And the more ambiguous symbols you have all around your process chart makes it hard for people to understand. So keep it simple wherever you can, and try and enjoy it as a collaborative session with your team. Okay, so one of the easiest sort of process maps we can start to look at, and everybody will have seen these, is a flowchart map. So these are really simple, generally quite small processes, not anything that's too company-wide. This is quite a small, discrete process. This is a perfect tool. And we start at the top and we work our way down. You can see in this little diagram here, there's a little decision point where the decision is sent back up the stream if it's a negative, or carries on down if it's a positive. The important thing is to make it clear to everybody in the team, everybody around the table, that we all agree on what those process steps are. So whatever type of process mapping we use, there are sort of 5 key steps that we want to focus on, really, to make sure that we get this to be a really successful and hopefully enjoyable activity with the team that you're working with. So first is to really define the start and end of the process. How do we know when it started and how do we know when it's finished? And really understand that trigger, what causes it to happen, what springs everybody into activity. Get those activities listed, brainstorm them initially and then get them down in order. Then get your connections in there, add your gateways and add your decision points as you need to. And if you're going to do a little exercise yourself, it's surprising how complicated process mapping, even a small process, might be. Have a look at this. Choose one of these scenarios and try do it yourself. Well, I hope you had a little go at that, and I hope you found some of the challenges, even something as simple as buying a fast food meal, for example. When does that process end? When did your process end? Does it end when you pay the person at the counter? Does it end when you take your meal away? Does it end when you've discarded all the litter at the end of the meal and put it into the recycling? We've got to really get those well defined before we get going, so we all understand what it is that we're mapping. Spaghetti mapping is a fantastic tool, particularly if you've got a large area and you're trying to understand the movement of people. It's a really great visual representation and a great way to identify waste in your operations or your work area. So if you remember Tim Wood, the 7 wastes from previous sections, this is a really great way to identify those. And it is literally imagining that you've got a piece of chalk on the sole of everybody's shoe and you can see that path that they're all tracing around the organisation. It's great in terms of identifying areas where there's a lot of or excess travel, but it's also great from a health and safety perspective because you can see where there's a constriction of people, where there's a lot of activity going on, where things may be getting a little bit too busy or things might get in the way of each other. A fantastic tool, so simple but really, really powerful. So just a few reminders. There are many different ways you can map a process, but these little reminders should help. Make sure you're mapping at the right level. You're at a really high level, a strategic level in your business, wall to wall, or are you getting into the real detail at level 3 about a really intricate process and a lot of steps involved in that process. Choose the right level that's appropriate for the process you're looking at and stay at that level. It is really easy to accidentally go delving deeper and deeper than you need to. So your job as a facilitator is to keep it at the right level for that particular process. Then if you need to go down later, you can do that separately. As I say, map using post-it notes or a whiteboard. You're going to do lots of scribbling, you're going to do lots of changing, and that's absolutely fine. If you need to put it in software at the end, that's fine, but only if you need to. Remember, don't waste your efforts, don't over-process it if your whiteboard or your post-it notes are doing everything that you need them to do. And the last thing is just to make sure that as a facilitator that you're getting everybody's view around the room, that you're listening to the people that are there, that you're taking everybody's opinion and you're getting consensus on what that process is. From there, you can start to build on improvement.